Hi guys, just imagine for a second, it's the year 1930. The world you know has collapsed overnight. Banks have shut their doors. Families are crying at their dinner tables because there is no dinner. Fathers who once wore clean suits to work now stand on the streets holding signs that read, "Willing to work for food." And mothers are staring at empty cupboards, wondering how to feed their children. This was America during the Great Depression, a time when money vanished like smoke in the wind, and millions were left with nothing. But in the middle of this hopelessness, there was a group of people who not only survived without a single dollar, but they created a whole way of life out of nothing. They were called hobos, and tonight, as the lights dim and your mind drifts back almost a century, let me take you into their world to show you how they turned desperation into resilience, hunger into brotherhood, and nothingness into a form of survival that still inspires us today. So sit back, because this isn't just history. It asks the story of how to survive when survival feels impossible. Dim the lights, let's begin. The crash of 1929 shattered everything. The stock market collapsed in a way nobody could have predicted, and in just a few weeks, fortunes disappeared, businesses folded, and jobs evaporated. Imagine working for 20 years, saving every penny in your bank, only to walk to that bank one morning and find a sign that reads, "Closed, no funds available." People who once lived comfortably were suddenly standing in bread lines that stretched 4 blocks, holding tin cups for a bowl of soup. America had never seen desperation on such a massive scale. And yet, in this chaos, hobos emerged not as beggars, not as criminals, but as wanderers who refused to be tied down by hopelessness. So who exactly were the hobos? To understand them, picture a man with a tattered coat, carrying a small bundle, tied at the end of a stick. He has no home, no steady job, and yet he walks with a strange kind of confidence. He knows how to read the railroads like others read newspapers. He knows where to find food, where kindness lives, and where danger hides. He is part of an underground society, a brotherhood without borders, connected not by money but by survival. That was the life of a hobo. But life as a hobo wasn't random wandering. They had their own systems, their own culture. They created a secret language of chalk marks, symbols carved or drawn near houses, on fences, on sidewalks. A triangle with 2 hands meant safe place to sleep. A cat drawing meant a kind-hearted woman lives here. She might give food. An angry dog symbol meant danger, move on. This hobo code was their survival map, a hidden guide passed from one traveler to the next, invisible to ordinary people, but clear as day to those who lived on the road. This wasn't chaos, it was organized survival. Now let's talk about hunger, because hunger was the one companion every hobo carried. How do you fill your stomach with no job and no money? Hobos had tricks. Many knocked on doors, but they did it with respect. They didn't just beg. They offered something in return. "Ma'am, I can chop your firewood, fix your fence, clean your yard. Just a plate of food is all I ask." Some people slammed doors in their faces, but others, families who themselves had little, still shared what they could. A slice of bread, a spoonful of beans, a bit of stew. And when kindness was shown, hobos remembered. They left a chalk mark near that house, so the next wanderer would know kindness lives here. But hobos couldn't always rely on strangers. They learned to forage, to find wild plants that could be eaten, to fish in rivers, to cook scraps into stews that filled more than just the stomach, they filled the spirit. Picture a campfire near the railroad tracks, a tin can balanced above the flames, a group of hobos passing around bread crusts and telling stories. That scene, repeated thousands of times across America, became their version of family dinners. They called these camps hobo jungles. They weren't jungles of trees, but jungles of survival, little gathering spots where wanderers came together to share food, music, and company. And oh, the music. Hobos carried harmonicas, banjos, and voices that could turn sorrow into song. Around the fire, a hobo might sing about the town he left behind, the girl he loved, or the hunger he felt. These songs became the soundtrack of survival. Imagine the cold night air, smoke rising, and voices harmonizing under the stars. They had nothing, yet in those moments they had everything. But let's not romanticize too much. Life as a hobo was brutally hard. The railroads, their highways of survival, were both opportunity and danger. Freight trains carried goods across the country, and hobos hid in boxcars to travel from place to place. But climbing on and off moving trains was dangerous. One wrong step and you could lose a leg or your life. And then there were the bulls, railroad police. Their job was to keep hobos off the trains, and they were not gentle. Stories tell of hobos beaten, arrested, even killed for hopping trains. Yet, despite the danger, thousands risked it every day because movement was life. Staying in one place meant starvation. Moving meant hope. Within this world, hobos created their own code of honor. They believed in sharing, in honesty among themselves, in respecting those who helped them. A true hobo never stole from another hobo. A true hobo worked if he could, sang if he couldn't, and shared whatever he had. It wasn't a perfect world. There were criminals too, but the culture of the hobo was about dignity in the face of poverty. That code made them different from beggars or thieves. They weren't running from life, they were chasing survival. Now let's zoom in to one hobo's life, because statistics don't tell the whole story. Imagine a young man named Jack. He grew up on a farm in Kansas, but when the Depression hit, the farm collapsed. His father lost everything. His mother cried at night, and Jack knew he couldn't just sit there. So one morning, with a blanket tied to a stick, he walked to the railroad tracks and became a hobo. His first ride on a freight train was terrifying. The roar of the wheels, the freezing wind cutting through his thin coat. But when the train stopped hundreds of miles away, he felt something new. Freedom. He was poor, yes, but he was moving. And moving meant possibility. Jack found his first hobo jungle near Chicago. There were men twice his age, gray-bearded wanderers, who had seen it all. They welcomed him, shared their food, and taught him the code. Never take more than you need. Always share a fire. Leave a mark for the next guy. Jack learned how to ask for food without shame, how to keep his knife sharp, how to listen to the sound of the tracks to know which train was slowing down. He learned that being a hobo wasn't just about running from hunger. It was about running towards survival, wherever survival could be found. Jack's story was repeated 1,000,000 times across America. Boys who left farms, men who left cities, fathers who couldn't feed their families, they all became hobos. Some left letters at home, promising to return when times were better. Some never returned. But on the road, they found each other, and in each other, they found strength. Part of what made hobos remarkable was their ability to see the world differently. While most people saw the Depression as the end of life as they knew it, hobos saw it as a challenge to adapt. They became philosophers of the road. Some would sit by fires and say, maybe money was never real. Maybe what matters is food, shelter, and friendship. Others believed their wandering gave them wisdom others lacked. They saw America in its rawest form, not the shining cities or the rich banks, but the small towns, the kind hearts, the cruel ones, the reality of humanity stripped bare. Hobos also became storytellers. They told tales of kind widows who fed them, of cruel sheriffs who chased them, of trains that carried them across endless fields. These stories passed through the hobo network like currency. In a way, their stories were their currency. They traded them like coins, enriching each other with words instead of dollars. Let's not forget the children. Yes, there were child hobos boys, as young as 12 or 13, who ran away from starving families, hoping to find work elsewhere. They became part of this brotherhood, guided by older hobos who taught them the ways. It was dangerous, heartbreaking, and yet it showed the resilience of youth in desperate times. So why does part 1 of our story matter? Because it sets the stage for understanding the hobo world. The Great Depression destroyed money, jobs, and security. But in that destruction, a new way of life emerged. Hobos weren't heroes in the traditional sense, but they were survivors. They proved that even when every system fails, human beings can find ways to endure. With chalk marks, tin cans, train rides, and campfires, they wrote a story of resilience that we still remember. And as the night deepens, as we dim the lights once more, think about this. If tomorrow everything you own vanished, if banks closed and jobs disappeared, could you survive? Could you knock on a stranger's door, climb onto a moving train, eat from a tin can, sing under the stars, and call that life? The hobos did. They survived without a single dollar, and in doing so, they left behind more than just stories. They left a blueprint for resilience. The train whistles in the distance, a haunting sound that cuts through the night sky. For the hobos, that whistle was more than just steel and steam. It was a call, a signal, a promise of escape. Every set of tracks led somewhere different, somewhere new, and every moving freight train was both a danger and a lifeline. Hobos lived and breathed by those tracks, because without them, survival meant being stuck in towns that had nothing to give. So they learned the rhythm of the rails, the schedules of trains, the sound of wheels slowing down, the smell of coal smoke in the wind. For them, railroads were not just transportation. They were veins of life running across a starving country. To ride the rails was not simple. It required skill, courage, and sometimes recklessness. A hobo had to know how to run alongside a moving boxcar, grab the ladder, and haul himself inside before the train picked up speed. One wrong grip, one misstep, and you could lose a hand, a leg, or your life. Yet they did it daily, because staying behind meant hunger. And inside those rattling boxcars, pressed against crates, or sitting in the dark corners, hobos found the freedom of movement. They might be penniless, but they were not rooted. They were always moving forward. But the railroads had guardians, the bulls, or railroad police. These men were tough, merciless, and trained to keep hobos away from the trains. For a bull, catching a hobo meant either dragging him off the train with fists and boots, or hauling him to the nearest jail. Many hobos told stories of brutal beatings, of being left in the middle of nowhere, miles from water or shelter, just as punishment for daring to ride. To a bull, hobos were trespassers, criminals leeching off the railroads. To hobos, bulls were predators, always hunting, always lurking in the shadows of the train yards. It became a game of cat and mouse. Sneak in, hide, ride, and escape. Every hobo learned strategies to avoid bulls. They moved quietly, stuck together in small groups, and often climbed aboard trains in remote areas far from stations. Some even studied the patrol habits of bulls, learning when they were least alert. There were also stories of daring escapes, where hobos jumped from moving trains into bushes or rivers to avoid capture. They carried the scars of those jumps for life, but to them, freedom was worth it. Yet, inside those boxcars, among the roar of steel and the cold wind, friendships blossomed. Imagine 3 strangers huddled in the dark, shivering in the night, passing around a single loaf of bread. In those moments, strangers became brothers. They told each other their past farms lost, factories closed, families left behind. They spoke of dreams of finding work in the next town, of earning $1 just to send home to loved ones. These conversations, whispered in the dark, stitched together a brotherhood that money could never buy. Every stop along the tracks became a new chapter. A town with a factory might mean a chance at temporary work. A farming village might mean food in exchange for labor. And if there was nothing, then at least there was the road leading onward. Hobos learned to map the country in their heads, not with paper and ink, but with memories. That town's sheriff is cruel. Avoid him. That farm family by the river will feed you if you chop wood. That church has a soup kitchen, but only if you arrive early. This oral map passed from hobo to hobo, ensuring survival across thousands of miles. The hobo jungles near train yards became essential hubs. These makeshift camps weren't pretty, they were clusters of tents, cardboard shacks, and campfires. But within them, rules existed. Every newcomer was welcomed, but expected to contribute. If you had food, you shared it. If you had a song, you sang it. If you had news from another part of the country, you told it. These jungles were dirty, loud, and often smelled of smoke and sweat, but to hobos, they were safe havens. Around the fire, they felt human again. And it was in these jungles that the hobo code was strongest. Carved into wooden posts or scribbled in chalk, their secret symbols told others what to expect. A smiling face meant kindness nearby. An angry cross meant danger. A simple arrow pointed toward water. These marks were invisible to ordinary citizens, but to hobos they were a shared language of survival. Even without books or schools, they built a communication system that rivaled newspapers in efficiency. Life on the rails also reshaped their sense of time. Ordinary people lived by clocks, by work hours, by paydays. Hobos lived by seasons, by the next meal, by the sound of a train. For them, time wasn't measured in minutes, but in miles. A good ride across 3 states was a success. A bad week stranded in one town was a failure. This mindset gave them resilience. Every failure was temporary. Every train was a new chance. And then there were the dangers beyond bulls. Trains themselves were killers. Many hobos lost their lives, falling under wheels, slipping from ladders, or being crushed by cargo. Winters were brutal. Without proper coats, hobos froze inside boxcars, huddling together like animals just to survive the night. Summers burned them alive under the sun. Disease spread quickly in jungles where sanitation was non-existent. Every day was a gamble with death. Yet they endured, because the alternative, sitting still and starving, was worse. In this harsh world, legends grew. Every jungle had its storytellers, men who spun tales of hobos, who rode trains coast to coast, who outwitted bulls with clever tricks, who found miraculous feasts in the unlikeliest places. Some of these legends were exaggerated, but they gave hope. When you're freezing in a boxcar with an empty stomach, a story of a clever hobo finding roast chicken in a friendly farmhouse keeps you moving. Music carried hope too. On the rails, folk songs flourished. Hobos sang about wandering, about the freedom of the open road, about the pain of hunger, about lost love. These songs weren't just entertainment, they were therapy. A harmonica could lift spirits better than any meal. A chorus, sung by 10 voices around a fire, could drown out despair. The Great Depression had robbed people of money, but it couldn't silence their voices. Children of the rails carried their own sorrow. Teenagers, sometimes younger, rode trains to escape hunger at home. They often traveled in pairs for protection, watched over by older hobos who taught them the ways of the tracks. Many of these kids left behind letters, promising their parents they'd return with money someday. Some did, many didn't, but on the rails, they became part of the hobo family, learning lessons harsher than any classroom could teach. The bonds formed on trains and in jungles were unbreakable. A man you met one night by a fire might save your life the next day by pulling you onto a moving train. Another might give you his last piece of bread. Hobos created a system of trust stronger than the economy itself. Money had failed America, but trust, kindness, and shared struggle created a new currency. Some towns saw hobos as pests, but others embraced them. Farmers often valued their work. Hobos chopped wood, harvested crops, or fixed barns in exchange for meals. They were wanderers, but they weren't lazy. Work, no matter how small, gave them dignity. And the families who fed them didn't just see beggars. They saw men broken by a broken system. Sometimes, those acts of kindness were remembered for decades. Many hobos later wrote memoirs, recalling the nameless families who saved them with bread and soup. But the most fascinating part of the rail journeys was the philosophy they created. Hobos began to see themselves not as victims, but as free souls. They weren't tied to mortgages or debts. They weren't trapped in collapsing industries. They were poor, yes, but they were also mobile, adaptable, alive. Some even claimed that life on the rails was purer, more honest than the materialism that had crashed with Wall Street. To them, every mile was a lesson, every fire a classroom, every stranger a teacher. The rails shaped not only their survival, but their identity. Hobos started calling themselves Knights of the Road. They wore the title with pride. In a society that had discarded them, they forged a new sense of belonging. They were outcasts, yes, but outcasts with courage. So when you think of the Great Depression, don't just picture breadlines and closed banks. Picture the endless trains stretching across America, boxcars rattling with hidden passengers who refused to stop moving. Picture the chalk marks on fences, the fires in the jungles, the songs in the night. Picture men and boys who risked everything not to give up. That was life on the rails. That was the journey of the hobos. And as the wheels of another freight train echo into the distance, remember this: the hobos survived not because they had money, but because they had motion, brotherhood, and unshakable will. The railroads were their arteries, their lifeblood, their salvation. They risked everything to ride them, and in doing so, They wrote a chapter of history that still teaches us today. When life stands still, you die. But when you keep moving, even without $1, you survive. Survival without money, 3 simple words. But for the hobos of the Great Depression, those words shaped every hour of every day. Hunger wasn't a visitor, it was a shadow that never left. Every growl of the stomach was a reminder that life had become a constant negotiation. Effort traded for scraps, courage traded for kindness, and skill traded for survival. The hobos didn't have wallets filled with cash, but they did carry something far more valuable: resourcefulness. The first and most essential tactic of survival was food. Hobos became experts at finding it, asking for it, and sometimes creating it out of nothing. Knocking on doors was common, but it wasn't simple begging. A true hobo always offered work in exchange. They might chop wood, haul water, repair a fence, or sweep a yard. For a farmer's wife staring at her own empty cupboards, even the smallest chore done by a stranger could mean a few moments of relief. And for the hobo, it meant a meal, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, but always life-saving. But when doors were slammed in their faces, hobos turned to other methods. They scavenged in alleys, behind restaurants, picking out scraps that others discarded. They became skilled at identifying edible plants, dandelion greens, wild onions, berries, and knew which rivers had fish that could be caught with a simple line and hook. In towns where kindness was rare, they turned fields, streams, and even trash bins into survival grounds. Cooking became an art of transformation. Imagine a tin can placed carefully on stones over a small fire. Into it went whatever they could find: potato skins, old bread, bits of beans, maybe a sliver of meat if fortune smiled. Stirred together, it became hobo stew, thin and humble, but warm and filling. Around the fire, they shared that stew as if it were a feast. For men who had nothing, a few mouthfuls of hot food felt like a king's banquet. But food wasn't just about eating, it was about dignity. Hobos created an unspoken rule: if you had something, you shared it. No hobo ate in front of another without offering a piece. This was survival in its purest form, built on fairness, built on trust. One day you had nothing and someone fed you. The next day you returned the kindness. It was a cycle that kept them alive, not just physically, but emotionally. Water was another challenge. Rivers, streams, and public pumps became lifelines. Hobos learned where water could be found in every town, memorizing wells, fountains, and faucets. They carried tin cups or old bottles, filling them whenever possible. Dehydration was a silent killer, and in hot summers, water was more precious than food. Some hobos even marked hidden wells with their chalk code, leaving arrows and symbols for the next wanderer who might stumble through thirsty. Shelter was equally vital. Not every night could be spent in a boxcar. When trains weren't an option, hobos built small lean-tos out of scrap wood, cardboard, or canvas. In jungles, they used branches to form makeshift huts. In cities, they slept under bridges or inside abandoned buildings. Winters were the hardest cold, cut through rags like knives. To survive, hobos slept huddled together, sharing body heat, or stuffed newspapers into their clothes for insulation. One hobo's trick was to warm stones by a fire, then wrap them in cloth and tuck them inside blankets to keep the cold away. Little innovations like this made the difference between waking up alive or frozen. And then there was work. Work was rare during the Depression, but hobos hunted for it relentlessly. They became seasonal laborers, following harvests across the country. In spring and summer, they picked fruit in orchards or harvested wheat in fields. In autumn, they gathered potatoes or cut timber. A few days of back-breaking labor might earn them meals, maybe a small wage, but more importantly, it gave them purpose. Work meant they weren't just drifters. They were men fighting to maintain dignity. Odd jobs also kept them alive. Some shined shoes in town squares. Others washed dishes in diners or swept floors in shops. The payment wasn't always cash. Often it was food, a warm bed for a night, or even just leftover bread. But to a hobo, that was enough. They weren't chasing riches, they were chasing survival, one small job at a time. Yet survival was never just about the body, it was about the spirit. The hobos developed philosophies that turned hardship into meaning. They often said, "You can't starve a man who has nothing to lose." This mindset gave them strength. They laughed when laughter seemed impossible. They sang when silence could have crushed them. They told stories when despair threatened to take over. Their survival wasn't built only on firewood, and Stewart was built on hope. Music became one of their strongest tools of endurance. Hobos carried harmonicas, banjos, or simply their voices. Songs rose out of jungles like prayers. They sang about freedom, about sorrow, about the wide open road. Folk songs like Big Rock Candy Mountain captured their dreams of a place where food was endless and troubles vanished. Singing kept their hearts alive, even when their stomachs were empty. Another tactic of survival was community. A lone hobo could survive a few days, but a group could survive weeks. In jungles, everyone had a role. One man gathered firewood, another cooked, another played music, another told stories to lift spirits. Together, they created micro-societies that protected them from despair. The bonds formed in those jungles often lasted lifetimes. Many hobos later said the Brotherhood of the Rails was the strongest family they ever knew. But survival also required caution. Not every stranger was trustworthy. Some hobos were criminals who preyed on others. Some towns were hostile, with sheriffs eager to jail or drive out wanderers. That's why the chalk code was so important. A small drawing on a fence could mean the difference between a meal and a beating, between shelter and jail. Knowledge was power, and sharing that knowledge kept the community safe. One of the most remarkable aspects of hobo survival was their code of ethics. It wasn't written in books, but every true hobo knew it. Respect property. Never steal. Always help another hobo. Leave places cleaner than you found them. Work for what you take when possible. This code turned them from aimless drifters into a culture, into a society bound by values. Even in the darkest times, they held on to principles. Children of the rails learned these lessons quickly. Older hobos mentored the young, teaching them not only how to ride trains, but how to live with honor. Stories tell of young boys who entered jungles, scared and hungry, only to be embraced by men who treated them like sons. These older hobos became teachers, fathers, and protectors, ensuring that the spirit of survival carried into the next generation. Illness, of course, was a constant threat. With no doctors, no hospitals, hobos treated each other with whatever knowledge they had. Herbs, home remedies, and rest were their medicine. Some carried small first aid kits passed down from soldiers of the Great War. Injuries from trains, infections, frostbite, these were daily realities. Yet even here, community mattered. A sick hobo was not abandoned. He was nursed by others, because tomorrow the roles could be reversed. And through all of this, hobos managed to hold on to one priceless possession: hope. They hoped the next town would be kinder, the next job more permanent, the next meal more filling. They hoped the depression would end and life would return to normal. Hope became the invisible fuel that kept them walking, riding, and surviving. When we strip down their tactics: food from doors, water from streams, shelter from scraps, work from fields, it's easy to think of hobos as desperate men clinging to life. But the truth is far deeper. They were innovators. They turned tin cans into cookware, chalk into maps, scraps into meals, and strangers into brothers. They didn't just survive the depression. They created a living blueprint of how to endure when the world collapses. Think of this. The average American family in the 1930s sat in their homes, staring at bills they couldn't pay, jobs they couldn't find, and futures they couldn't see. Hobos, on the other hand, stepped onto the rails and said, "If one place won't feed me, another will. If one town rejects me, the next might welcome me." They embodied movement, adaptability, resilience. They refused to stand still in despair. Every night, when they gathered around fires in their jungles, they weren't just eating scraps of stew, they were sharing lessons of survival. They were proving to themselves and to the world that life isn't measured by money in your pocket, but by the fire in your spirit. That was the ultimate survival tactic. So when we ask how hobos survived the Great Depression without a single dollar, the answer is this. They survived by turning poverty into creativity, by turning strangers into allies, by turning fear into courage, and by turning nothing into something. Their tactics weren't just about feeding the body. They were about feeding the soul. And that, more than anything, is why their story still matters today. The years rolled forward, but the echoes of the hobos lingered long after the Great Depression faded into memory. Their lives had not only been about surviving hunger and homelessness. They had carved out a philosophy that reshaped how hardship could be endured, how dignity could be protected even in poverty, and how freedom could be redefined beyond money and possessions. What they left behind was more than a story of desperate men. It was a blueprint for resilience, simplicity, and community in its purest form. The first lesson that rises from the hobo experience is resilience. Hobos were not people who gave up when life collapsed around them. The banks had shut their doors, factories had gone silent, and streets were filled with despair. Yet hobos refused to sink into paralysis. They adapted, and in adaptation, they discovered strength. This resilience was not loud or heroic in the way movies might portray it. It was quiet, steady, and stubborn. It was the resilience of a man who knocked on 20 doors before he finally got a crust of bread, who climbed into a freezing boxcar, knowing the risk of being beaten by a railroad bull, who sang a song in the middle of hunger just to remind himself that joy still existed. This resilience is something modern life often forgets. Today, when conveniences cushion most struggles, the idea of enduring days without food or walking miles without shoes seems unimaginable. But hobos proved that the human spirit can endure far more than comfort would have us believe. Their survival whispers to us, "You are stronger than you think. You can adapt, you can endure, you can survive." Another powerful lesson is community. The hobos built an invisible web of connection that stretched across towns, cities, and endless miles of railroad track. A stranger's loaf of bread, a farmer's pot of stew, a fellow hobo's shared blanket. These were the transactions that kept their society alive. Community, for them, was not optional. It was the foundation of survival. A man traveling alone could last a few days. A man traveling with brothers could last weeks, even months. Around the campfire, they became more than wanderers. They became family. They told stories that gave meaning to suffering, sang songs that replaced silence with unity, and cooked stews where everyone's scraps became one shared meal. Their brotherhood showed that even when the world crumbles, human connection can rebuild a sense of home. The hobos also carried the lesson of simplicity. Stripped of possessions, they learned to live with only what fit into a small bindle. A blanket, a pot, a knife. These few tools became their entire world. At first glance, this may look like loss, but in reality, it was freedom. They redefined wealth not as the things you own, but as the experiences you gather. The kindness you give and receive, the songs you sing by the fire, the miles you walk under open skies. Simplicity is often mistaken for deprivation, but the hobos knew better. They taught that sometimes life becomes clearer when reduced to essentials. A meal tastes richer when it's earned. A fire feels warmer when shared. A blanket feels softer when it shields you from winter winds. They proved that happiness does not require abundance. It requires appreciation. Freedom is another central philosophy left behind by hobos. To ride the rails was to reject the confinement of walls, debts, and expectations. They were not bound to a single city or factory, not chained to the despair of one failed job. Every train carried the promise of movement, of a new beginning. Even in hardship, that sense of freedom gave hobos dignity. They weren't prisoners of the depression. They were wanderers on their own terms. Of course, freedom came at a cost. It meant danger from bulls, hunger in strange towns, and nights spent under the open sky. But to the hobos, that price was worth paying. They embraced risk because risk meant choice, and choice meant life. Their freedom was raw, unpolished, and sometimes brutal, but it was real. In a world where so many felt trapped, hobos became symbols of the unbroken will to keep moving forward. Beyond resilience, community, simplicity, and freedom, the hobos left us with a code of ethics that shines like a lantern in the dark corridors of history. Respect property. Offer help when you can always leave a place better than you found it. Never harm. Children honor women. Work for what you take when possible. And above all, uphold the dignity of yourself and others. This code gave them identity and pride. They were not lawless beggars, but men who believed in principles even when society abandoned them. By following this code, they kept order among chaos and reminded themselves that survival without honor is not survival at all. It is this ethical foundation that turned hobos into more than drifters. They became custodians of a forgotten kind of integrity. The legacy of hobos also lies in their creativity. With almost nothing, they created culture, songs, poems, chalk codes, carvings on boxcars, and campfire stories. They transformed hardship into art. These creations weren't luxuries, they were survival tools. A song could keep despair away. A story could keep hope alive. A carved symbol could guide the next traveler to safety. This is perhaps one of the most powerful lessons. Even when stripped of everything, the human soul can still create beauty. The hobos influenced America more than most realize. Their songs became the roots of folk and blues traditions. Their stories shaped literature about the Depression era. Their culture of resilience seeped into the national identity. Even phrases like on the road or riding the rails carry echoes of their journeys, long after the jungles have vanished. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of all is hope. Hobos never stopped moving, because movement itself was hope in action. To stay in one place meant despair, but to climb aboard a train meant possibility. Every mile of track was a thread weaving them toward tomorrow. They believed tomorrow could be better, even if today was cruel. That hope was not naive was essential. Their hope was contagious. Families who saw them passing often shared food, not just out of pity, but because they admired the courage of men who refused to give up, even in their own suffering. Hobos gave people a mirror of resilience. They showed the nation that survival was possible, even when money, jobs, and homes were gone. As the Depression eased and jobs returned, many hobos settled back into society. They took up trades, built families, and lived quieter lives. But they carried with them the lessons of the rails. To live simply, the hobo spirit lived on, not in the rails themselves, but in the wisdom of those who walked them. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize hobos, to see them as adventurers on the open road. But their reality was harsh, cold nights, empty bellies, dangers from both men and machines. Yet it is precisely because of this reality that their philosophy holds such weight. They were enduring it, and in enduring, they discovered truths that comfort even today. What they teach us is simple yet profound. Survival is not about what you hold in your hands, but what you hold in your heart. Money can vanish, jobs can disappear, houses can crumble, but courage, kindness, and hope can carry you through any storm. In our modern world of abundance and distraction, the hobo story still whispers valuable reminders. It tells us to live with less and value it more. It tells us to build communities where kindness is currency. It tells us to keep moving when life feels stuck. It tells us that even when the world seems broken, there is always a way to endure. Imagine for a moment that the hobos could stand among us today. They would not speak of the despair of the depression. They would speak of the songs sung in jungles, the meals shared by strangers, the friendships born on boxcars. They would not tell us that money is unimportant, but they would tell us that money alone cannot define survival. They would remind us that human connection, dignity, and resilience are worth more than any dollar bill, and so their legacy lives on. Every story of kindness to a stranger, every song sung in hard times, every community built in the ashes of struggle carries the fingerprints of the hobos. They are not forgotten wanderers of a past century. They are voices in the wind, still whispering to those who listen. You can survive. You can endure. You can live without a dollar, but never without courage. The lights of the Depression may have dimmed long ago, but the flame of the hobos still glows, not in jungles beside railroads, but in the hearts of all who hear their story. They are a testament that even in the hardest times, life finds a way, not through wealth, not through power, but through the unbreakable spirit of ordinary people who refused to surrender. And perhaps, in that truth, the hobos achieved something extraordinary. They showed us that survival itself is not the end, it is the beginning of wisdom. For from the rails of despair came the tracks of resilience, and those tracks still lead us forward, reminding us with every mile that no matter how empty the pocket, the human spirit is never truly broke. The streets of America in the early 1900s were alive with contradictions, a nation caught between the old world and the new, where horse-drawn wagons clattered alongside the rumble of the first automobiles, and where gas lamps flickered just as electric light bulbs began to glow in shop windows. Life at the start of the 20th century was not glamorous for most people. It was raw, gritty, and demanding, yet filled with the excitement of progress. If you walked through a typical city in 1905, you'd notice the thick smell of coal smoke in the air, factory whistles echoing every morning, and children in ragged clothes rushing either to school or to work in textile mills. Poverty was everywhere, but so was ambition. The American dream was being stitched together in sweatshops, steel mills, and farms that stretched across endless plains. Families were large, often with 6 or more children, because not every child was expected to survive infancy, and extra hands were needed to help with work at home. For many Americans, especially immigrants arriving through Ellis Island, life began in crowded tenement buildings. These were dark, poorly ventilated apartments, packed with families who had just crossed the Atlantic, seeking opportunity. Rooms had no running water, and toilets were often shared by dozens of people. Diseases like tuberculosis spread quickly in such conditions, and yet families clung to hope, believing that with enough hard work, the next generation would have better. Men worked long hours in factories where machines were dangerous and accidents common. Steelworkers in Pittsburgh labored near molten metal in suffocating heat. Miners went deep underground for meager wages, always facing the risk of cavins or deadly gas. Women often worked in garment factories, bent over sewing machines for 12 or 14 hours a day, earning just a few dollars a week. Children, some as young as 8 or 9, worked beside their parents in mills, their small hands useful for reaching into machines, though many were maimed or killed doing so. Still, amid the harshness, there was progress. By the early 1900s, cities were buzzing with new inventions. Electric streetcars replaced horse-drawn trolleys, and elevated railroads moved passengers above the chaos of the streets. Telephones, once a novelty, were becoming more common, though most families still relied on letters delivered by postmen who walked miles daily. In rural areas, the majority of Americans still lived without electricity or running water. Women washed clothes by hand, carrying buckets of water from wells, and families heated homes with wood or coal stoves. Winter mornings often began with the crackle of fire, as fathers or older sons rushed to light stoves before the house froze. Life was physically demanding in every way, yet it created resilience. Social life revolved around community and church gatherings. Families entertained themselves with music played on pianos or phonographs, which spun scratchy records that seemed magical at the time. People gathered on porches in the evenings, talking, while children played in the dusty streets. In cities, vaudeville theaters thrived, offering comedy, music, and magic shows for just a few cents. Baseball was emerging as the national pastime, with players like Ty Cobb becoming heroes. Newspapers were everywhere, sold by newsboys on every corner, shouting headlines. Reading the paper was a daily ritual, connecting Americans to both local gossip and world events. But the early 1900s were also marked by stark inequality. The wealthy elite, known as the Gilded Age millionaires, lived in mansions with electric chandeliers, servants, and European vacations. Families like the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts flaunted unimaginable wealth, while most Americans lived paycheck to paycheck. The divide between rich and poor was vast, fueling tensions that would later inspire labor unions and social reforms. For ordinary people, survival meant budgeting every penny, sewing clothes by hand, growing vegetables in backyard gardens, and reusing everything until it fell apart. Immigration defined the era. Millions of people poured into the United States from Italy, Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Eastern Europe, carrying dreams of freedom and opportunity. In cities like New York and Chicago, entire neighborhoods spoke different languages, filled with bakeries, markets, and traditions from the old country. While immigrants faced discrimination and exploitation, they also built the backbone of America's workforce. They laid railroad tracks across the continent, dug canals, and filled factories with labor that fueled the industrial boom. Healthcare was primitive by modern standards. Doctors often visited homes carrying little black bags of tools and medicines, but antibiotics did not yet exist. Simple infections could be fatal, and childbirth was risky for women. Many relied on home remedies, herbal concoctions, and the advice of elders. Yet, public health slowly improved with new sanitation systems, cleaner water supplies, and awareness of hygiene. The average life expectancy was still low, around 50 years, but rising steadily as science advanced. Education was becoming more widespread, though not all children had the luxury of attending school. Rural schools were one-room buildings where a single teacher taught children of all ages. In cities, schools were overcrowded, but reformers were pushing for child labor laws to ensure more kids learned to read and write instead of spending their days in factories. For many immigrant families, education was seen as the golden key to escaping poverty. Parents who could not read themselves worked tirelessly to make sure their children could. Life in the early 1900s was also deeply shaped by gender roles. Men were expected to work and provide, while women kept the household running. Yet women were beginning to push against these boundaries. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum, and by 1920, women would win the right to vote. In the meantime, they proved their strength, daily managing homes without electricity, raising children in poverty, and contributing wages through factory work or domestic service. The resilience of women was one of the quiet engines that powered early 20th century America. In the countryside, farming remained the way of life for millions. Families rose before dawn, children doing chores alongside parents. Horses pulled plows, milk was carried in heavy pails, and every season brought endless labor. The pace of life was slow compared to cities, but isolation was common, and many farm families struggled with debt and poor crop prices. The arrival of mail-order catalogs like Sears, Roebuck, and Co. connected rural Americans to the modern world, letting them buy everything from clothing to farming tools delivered by trains. For the first time, even those living far from cities could dream of owning modern goods. Transportation was transforming everything. The Wright brothers had just taken flight, igniting imaginations about the future of travel. Automobiles, once a luxury, were becoming more affordable thanks to Henry Ford's assembly line, which in a few years would put the Model T within reach of ordinary Americans. Roads were still rough and muddy, but the freedom of driving represented a revolution. Trains remained the backbone of long-distance travel, carrying passengers across vast distances at speeds unimaginable just a generation earlier. Entertainment also reflected the spirit of the era. Silent films flickered in Nickelodeon theaters, where crowds gasped at moving pictures that brought cowboys, comedians, and daring adventures to life. Music halls rang with ragtime, and dances like the waltz and foxtrot brought people together. Evenings were often spent in simple joys, reading aloud by lamplight, playing cards, or telling stories by the fire. Life lacked modern conveniences, but it was rich in human connection. Despite hardships, optimism ran through the nation. America was growing, cities expanding, industries booming. People believed in progress, in the idea that tomorrow would be brighter than today. That belief carried them through illnesses, poverty, and exhaustion. It was a time when dreams were fragile but powerful, stitched into the fabric of daily struggle. The early 1900s were not easy years, but they were defining ones. They shaped generations with toughness, simplicity, and hope. Every factory whistle, every immigrant story, every child bent over a school book or sewing machine added to the story of a nation finding its identity. To walk through America then was to witness a country in the making, raw and imperfect, but alive with possibility. And that possibility is what made the struggle worth it. For in every crowded tenement and every dusty farm field, the promise of a better tomorrow was enough to keep people moving forward. And Americans found themselves standing at the edge of modernity, while still clinging to traditions of the past. The rhythm of daily life in this era was dictated by work. Whistles and bells structured the hours, and for many, the grind never seemed to end. Labor movements were gaining traction as men and women began to demand fairer wages and safer conditions, their voices echoing in strikes that sometimes turned violent. Yet, despite resistance from powerful industrialists, progress was being made slowly. Child labor laws were introduced in some states, and the first whispers of a regulated workday hinted at a future where exhaustion would not be the default condition of the working class. In the streets, vendors sold roasted peanuts, penny candies, and newspapers with screaming headlines, offering small indulgences to people weighed down by long shifts. Others threw open green spaces that provided a rare escape from the grayness of industrial neighborhoods. Technology continued to shape aspirations. The telephone spread further, connecting towns to cities, and electric lights illuminated shop windows late into the night, giving urban areas a glow that seemed almost magical to those arriving from rural villages. The automobile was changing how people imagined distance. Suddenly, travel was not tied only to trains. Roads were still rough, but the hum of engines was becoming a common sound. For young Americans, the car symbolized independence, the chance to drive away from old expectations and into new lives. At the same time, the nation's cultural landscape was evolving. African American communities, despite facing severe segregation and prejudice, were creating vibrant music and cultural traditions that would soon blossom into the Harlem Renaissance. Ragtime and blues carried stories of hardship and hope, filling dance halls with rhythms that spoke to resilience. Everyday life was still marked by simplicity. Meals were cooked from scratch, often heavy on bread, potatoes, and meat when it was affordable. Families gathered around wooden tables, and every bite was valued because waste was unthinkable. Ice boxes kept food cool, with large blocks of ice delivered by wagon, and milk came fresh in glass bottles left at the door. Women's roles remained centered around the home. Yet the suffrage movement was energizing a generation of women to seek rights beyond the kitchen. Demonstrations filled city streets, banners demanding the vote, and voices refusing to be silenced. Children were being shaped by a new sense of possibility, with education reform slowly opening doors, though many still left school early to work. Entertainment drew people together. Vaudeville, traveling circuses, and the first movie palaces gave working families affordable escapes from daily hardship. Silent film stars became icons, and Nickelodeon theaters flickered with moving images that hinted at dreams larger than reality. The early 1900s were years of transformation and tension, where poverty and progress coexisted, where struggle was constant, but so was determination. Americans lived hard, worked harder, and carried hope like a shield against adversity. Life demanded endurance, but it also offered glimpses of a future brighter than the soot-stained present. In every crowded street, every noisy factory, one day at a time, and the people who lived it carried both the scars and the pride of shaping the century to come.